From the earliest days of colonial slavery, Africans in the Americas refused to accept bondage without a fight. Wherever plantation masters held power, enslaved people ran away into the wild to build new societies of their own. These Maroons, self-liberated Africans and their descendants, created hidden towns in mountains, swamps, forests, and hinterlands. They grew crops, governed themselves, worshipped freely, and even waged war to defend their freedom. In many cases, these communities became full-fledged free nations. They signed peace treaties and controlled territory on terms the colonial powers had to respect. This is a story of that indomitable spirit. The black rebels who refused slavery's chains and carved out spaces of liberty. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, consider subscribing to the channel. We'd be grateful for your support. Let's dive into it. As colonial slavery spread, Maroon communities sprang up everywhere. By the 1500s, the word Maroon, from the Spanish word cimarron, was already used for fugitive slaves who escaped into the wild. Large groups of Africans and their children fled plantations and clustered in remote, hard-to-reach areas. They learned to live off the land by planting crops, hunting game, fishing rivers, and even trading with nearby indigenous people. In these places, they raised families and built societies on their own terms. They often kept their African cultural heritage alive, blending languages, religions, and social customs from their ancestors with new adaptations. Colonial records and later research emphasize the scale of this phenomenon. Maroon societies existed all over the Americas, from South Carolina to Brazil, notes historian Lynn Brown, and they became distinct cultures in their own right, blending elements from the various African tribes from which their inhabitants came. In short, every time an African slave walked away from bondage into the wilderness, a new chapter of self-liberation began. Across the Caribbean islands and the mainland, planters faced the constant threat of runaway communities. Massive military expeditions were often launched to hunt them, but in place after place the Maroons held their ground. Jamaican slaveholders famously could not crush the Maroons of Jamaica and were forced to sue for peace. In Suriname's jungle, Dutch and French colonists spent decades fighting guerrilla warfare only to make treaties and leave the Maroons in control of vast rainforests. This pattern repeated itself, and the very existence of Maroon nations challenged the logic of slavery itself. Even in North America, hidden Maroon enclaves took root. In the vast Great Dismal Swamp straddling North Carolina and Virginia, and in the bayous of Louisiana, self-liberated slaves chose not to travel north to seek freedom. Instead, they created free communal societies in hostile wetlands. These swampy landscapes were dangerous, full of alligators, insects, and predators, yet they nourished and shielded those who knew how to navigate them. With ancestral knowledge of the land, Maroons made these wetlands their home for generations. In every case, a key element of Maroon survival was secrecy, mobility, and solidarity. With these, they cultivated and cared for their unstable environment, turning danger into refuge. The shared experience of all Maroon communities was that freedom was not optional. They built churches, held councils, crowned leaders, and mobilized militias to defend their independence. Colonial authorities often complained that Maroons set up all sorts of artisans with kings who ruled over vast villages. One study calls Brazil's Great Quilombo of Palmares a true African state in the heart of colonial Brazil. The Maroons' very existence was a rebuke to slavery. Scholar Richard Price summarized that their new nations stood as heroic challenges to white authority, as the living proof of the existence of a slave society. Across mountains, jungles, and swamps, Maroons made freedom tangible. Perhaps no story of marriage is as well known as that of the Jamaican Maroons. After the English captured Jamaica from the Spanish in 1655, thousands of African slaves escaped into the mountainous interior and joined the already existing Spanish mulatto Maroon communities. Over time, two main Maroon nations emerged: the Leeward Maroons in Cockpit Country, led by Cudjoe or Cudjoe, and the Windward Maroons in the eastern Blue Mountains under the legendary Nanny. Both became famous for their guerrilla warfare against the British. British records and later Maroon traditions agree that Nanny and Cudjoe plagued the British plantation owners and soldiers so fiercely that they forced the British to draw up a treaty. That first peace treaty in 1738 and 1739 formally recognized the Maroons' autonomy. It granted them land and the right to self-govern, on condition they return any future runaway slaves to the British, the only concession they made. This agreement made the Jamaican Maroons de facto rulers of their territory, a nation within a nation. In fact, the Maroons of Moortown and Accompong lived under largely autonomous rule ever since. Nanny was given 500 acres for her community, New Nanny Town, today Moortown, and each Maroon town kept its own laws and councils. The colonial government could not send troops into the hills without Maroon permission. For decades, the arrangement held, and British colonists simply had to accept that a free black society thrived on Jamaican soil. Nanny of the Maroons, in particular, became a national symbol. Born in West Africa around 1680, Nanny was the spiritual and military leader of the Windward Maroons. She is famed for her wisdom as well as her ferocity. British accounts and later Jamaican oral history credit her with outsmarting slave hunters with ambushes, signal horns called abeng, and ingenious camouflage. Maroon legends even speak of her mystical abilities, though scholars interpret those tales as colonial efforts to demonize her rather than evidence of magic. What is certain is that Nanny led hundreds of formerly enslaved men and women in prolonged resistance. By the mid-18th century, she had united the Windward communities into a stronghold. When Nanny and the British negotiated in 1741, her advice steered them to accept independence. Her competence was so respected that centuries later, Jamaica named her as a national hero, the only woman and the only Maroon to receive that honor. Today, she even appears on Jamaica's $500 note. Maroon communities still celebrate Nanny's Day on Jamaica's National Heroes Day, recalling her legacy of freedom. The Leeward Maroons under Cudjoe or Cudjoe fought a separate war, culminating in the same peace treaty around 1739. For both the Eastern and Western Maroons, the treaties meant a century of relative peace. The Windward Maroons later signed another agreement in the 1740s. The Leeward Maroons fought again in 1795 in the Second Maroon War, but were ultimately defeated and many were exiled. Even so, the core descendants returned to Jamaica or remained in exile and kept their identity. Most Leeward Maroons eventually rejoined Jamaican life in Accompong town. The Windward communities of Moortown and Charlestown persisted to this day. Throughout Jamaican history, the Maroons preserved a sense of nationhood. They passed down a Creole religion called Kumina and kept British promises in view. In recent decades, Maroon chiefs have had disputes with Jamaican authorities over treaty rights, for example insisting that the 1739 treaty allows them to grow ganja on their lands. This shows that centuries later, autonomy remains central to their identity. For Afro-Jamaican descendants, Maroon history resonates deeply. The story of Nanny and Cudjoe flips the narrative. It starts before enslavement, emphasizing freedom and exploration over bondage. In the words of a Jamaican scholar, telling Jamaican resistance history through Nanny argues that the story of the African diaspora begins not with slavery and conquest, but with the common human heritage of freedom. This powerful sentiment, that our ancestors first and foremost sought liberty, echoes through Caribbean culture. By fighting the British to a standstill, these Maroons showed the world that Africans in Jamaica would not be slaves, but compatriots in a free nation. In the dense rainforests of South America, Maroon revolts produced multiple independent republics. In the Dutch colony of Suriname, which today is Suriname and French Guiana, dozens of plantations and forts ringed an immense wilderness. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, tens of thousands of African slaves rebelled. Many escaped to the interior, where they joined with indigenous peoples or formed entirely African-descended bands. Over a century of warfare, the Maroons fortified villages along rivers and waterfalls, living off cassava, game, and trade. By the mid-17th century, the plantation owners could no longer sustain endless campaigns against them. Negotiations began. From about 1760 to 1767, The Dutch agreed peace treaties with the major Maroon tribes. Peace treaties were concluded with the Nduka in 1760, the Samaka in 1762, and with the Matawai in 1767, granting them freedom. In each case, the European powers were recognizing that thousands of Maroons had gained their freedom before slavery's abolition. The terms typically confirmed the tribe's ownership of large territories in the interior and the right to their customs, in exchange for some cooperation such as returning future runaways. These agreements effectively created statelets. The Maroons kept their own chiefs, councils, and armies. The Ndiuka, also known as Okanisi, settled mainly along the Maroon and Tapanahoni rivers, the Saramaka in the central Suriname basin, the Matawai upriver from them. Each group's numbers were in the low thousands, roughly 2,500 to 3,000 at the time of treaty. Living almost as a state within a state, these Maroon societies flourished well into the modern era. They farmed, fished, mined gold, and even ran trade in the interior. In fact, Maroon River crews gained near monopoly control over freight routes between the Suriname interior and outposts on the coast in the 19th century. They developed distinct Creole cultures, including the Nduka and Saramacan languages and African Brazilian Portuguese religious traditions. Yet the treaties meant they officially governed themselves. The Surinamese and later independent governments largely left them alone, except for the required tribute of peace and occasional taxes. The symbolism of these treaties was profound. In Suriname, even today, October 10th is celebrated as Maroon Day, marking the 1760 Nduka Treaty. The Maroons still keep their clan systems and headmen known as capitaines. Remarkably, in 2000 and again in 2020, Suriname saw the election of a vice president, Ronnie Brunswijk, from a Maroon tribe, the Ndiuka. This marked an unprecedented rise of Maroon leadership to national power. Meanwhile, the Saramaka tribe's push for legal recognition culminated in a 2007 decision by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which ruled in favor of Saramaka land rights and resources. The court's finding that Maroons were entitled to collective rights to the lands their ancestors had occupied for centuries set a precedent for Indigenous and Maroon peoples worldwide. In other words, a long-fought dream of Maroon autonomy was vindicated on the international stage. All told, the Suriname Maroons exemplify the Free Nations theme literally. Their forests became their homeland, and they effectively held territory like any small republic. Even the colonial powers recognized it. Dutch maps of the late 18th century marked Dutch forts and plantations alongside the demarcated zones of the Nduka and Saramaka. Today, more than 250,000 people, both Maroon and Amerindian, live in the interior, many still speaking Maroon languages and upholding ancestral traditions. Their continuous presence is a living legacy of those runaway generations. In the Portuguese and Spanish colonies, similar free communities arose under different names. In Brazil, the word Quilombo was used for Maroon settlements. The most famous was Quilombo dos Palmares, in what is now northern Brazil. Founded around 1605 by about 40 Central African slaves, Palmares grew over decades into a confederation of villages covering a region perhaps the size of Portugal, with up to 20,000 to 30,000 inhabitants at its height. Dutch and Portuguese records describe well-fortified towns at Palmares, lines of palisades, gates held by heavy timbers, a king's house, churches, smithies, and fields. The king or rey exercised royal power and organized defense. In effect, Palmares functioned as a sovereign state in the jungle. That independence lasted nearly a century. Generations of Maroons lived freely, farming the land, raiding plantations, sometimes liberating more captives, and incorporating newcomers into their society. They even imposed a strict rule. Escaped slave fugitives who joined Palmares had to keep helping capture other runaways, and anyone who returned to slave hunting was executed. During this time, the Portuguese mounted dozens of expeditions to destroy Palmares. For over 80 years, the settlements withstood them. Only in 1694 to 1695 did Portuguese forces finally overrun and destroy the main village, killing the last king Zumbi dos Palmares in 1695. Zumbi, born around 1655, became a martyr and symbol of African freedom. He led Palmares from 1680 to 1695, and in Brazilian folklore he is revered as the ultimate fighter against slavery. Zumbi's legacy lives on. In 1969, Brazil chose November 20th, the date of his death, as Dia da Consciência Negra, or Black Awareness Day, to honor him and all those who resisted slavery. Even today, many Quilombo descendants in Brazil celebrate Zumbi's memory with cultural events. In academia too, Palmares is studied as an unparalleled case of Afro-Brazilian autonomy. As one anthropologist notes, Palmares was a federation of Maroon communities with its own economy and structure, indeed a free nation carved out of colonial territory. After the fall of Palmares, smaller Quilombos continued to emerge through the 18th and into the 19th century in Brazil, though none again achieved that scale. In modern times, the Quilombo legacy lives on through Quilombola communities. Following the end of Brazil's military government and the new Constitution of 1988, Brazil finally recognized the land claims of thousands of Quilombo descendants. Article 68 of the 1988 Constitution guaranteed definitive property rights of reminiscences of Quilombos on lands they had occupied. Though implementation has been slow, hundreds of communities have identified ancestral territories dating back to slave days. This legal recognition, over a century after abolition, embodies the idea that the Maroon Free Nation endures in the descendants who still live on those lands. Similar stories appeared in the Spanish Americas. In Colombia, the village of Palenque de San Basilio is famous as the first free African town in the Americas. Around 1599, an African called Bencos Bioho and about 30 others escaped Spanish captivity near Cartagena and founded a settlement in the marshes, which they fortified with wooden palisades, hence Palenque. Palenque became a refuge for countless fugitives. By the early 1600s, it was a multifamily community that repelled the Spanish soldiers sent against it. For over a century, the Palenqueros fought or negotiated their way to freedom. In 1713, after repeated skirmishes, a Spanish church official formally granted Palenque land rights on the condition they stop accepting new runaways. The Palenqueros accepted the legitimacy of their community's territory, but they famously refused to bind themselves to Spanish law beyond that. They insisted that all African escapees had a right to join them. Over time, Palenque evolved into a unique survivor among Colombia's once many Palenques. Most other Maroon towns were destroyed or abandoned. Today, the town of San Basilio de Palenque, with a population of a few thousand, still speaks its own Spanish African Creole language and practices ceremonies rooted in West and Central African culture. Its music and language even earned UNESCO recognition as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity. As scholar Ludmila Ferrari observes, while other Maroon communities were destroyed or dispersed, Palenque remained united and preserved its Creole language, its African dances, rituals, and social organization. In this way, Palenque stands as a living testimony. An African-style nation once existed on the shores of the Magdalena River, built by black exiles who refused to live in chains. Elsewhere in the Spanish Caribbean and Central America, Maroon towns also appeared, such as in Mexico, Panama, and Cuba, though none were as long-lasting as Jamaican or Palenque. On the island of St. Vincent, a mixed Afro-Indigenous people called the Black Caribs, later known as Garifuna, resisted British conquest for years, even signing treaties in the 1770s. That history took a tragic turn when most were deported to Central America in 1797. But the core theme is the same. In every corner of the Americas where slavery prevailed, new nations of freedom were born, however briefly. The age of colonial slavery is past, but the legacy of the Maroons lives on. Many descendants of those rebel societies still inhabit their ancestral lands, keeping alive languages, music, and governance traditions. In Jamaica, for example, the Windward and Leeward Maroon towns still exist with local councils and their own paramilitary ceremonies. Even if they now live in a modern country, they take pride in their treaty history and ancestral heroes. In Suriname, the Maroon villages remain substantial. Tens of thousands of Maroons live along Suriname's interior rivers and across the border in French Guiana. They celebrate October 10th as Maroon Day and hold large festivals remembering the treaties of the 1760s. In Brazil, hundreds of Quilombo communities known as Reminiscentes de Quilombos are fighting to secure formal title to their lands, invoking that 1988 constitutional promise. Colombia's Palenque community remains a symbol of resistance and is a celebrated cultural center. The modern world has grudgingly recognized some Maroon claims. UNESCO's designation of Palenque de San Basilio in 2005 officially acknowledges it as the first free town of African Americans. Jamaica's government enshrined Nanny of the Maroons as a national hero in 1975, honoring a figure of resistance. Suriname's Ndiuka people now observe the 1760 treaty date as a holiday. Perhaps most significantly, international law has begun to uphold Maroon land rights. In 2007, the Inter-American Court's Saramacca decision granted Maroon peoples collective control over their traditional forests. All these steps show that Maroon societies are not just footnotes to history, but living communities whose ancestral autonomy matters today. Emotionally, the story of the Maroons speaks powerfully to Black viewers. It reminds us that we come from people who seized their own fate. Against every expectation of defeat, they formed free societies with their heads held high. They took an African heritage and remade it on American soil. That heritage of freedom is encoded in celebrations and symbols. Jamaican school children learn about Queen Nanny. Brazilian children learn of Zumbi. Palenqueros dance their folkloric natua. The Saramacca still gather to recount treaty lore around the cauldron known as Gogosi. The Maroon example even reaches into the present-day Black liberation movements. The notion of building self-determining communities, defending communal land, and valuing African knowledge of the environment all draw inspiration from Maroon history. In the end, the great achievement of the Maroons was this: they shifted the conversation. Their legacy replaces the paradigmatic image of the man in chains with the image of an upright and powerful leader of African descent. For so long, history focused on slavery and suffering. The Maroon story tells us instead that our ancestors demanded to be free and built whole worlds in defiance of oppression. Their music, rituals, and self-rule survive as proof of what resilience can achieve. The Maroon nations they carved out may have been remote, but their message reaches all of us. Liberty was forged, not given. Today we remember the real Maroons, not just as fighters, but as founders of free Black nations, as foremothers and forefathers whose love of freedom still lights the way forward. Thank you for watching and honoring the story of the real Maroons. If this history moved you, make sure to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe so you won't miss our next journey into hidden chapters of Black history. Drop a comment below with your thoughts, reflections, or the Maroon stories that inspire you most. Together, we keep this legacy alive.